program. It's not going to give up its right of enrichment. This is a red line for Iran. And so this foolish and phony pretext to escalate war with Iran is going to remain. In terms of the ceasefire, I don't have the same alarm. A lot of people, and I understand where it comes from, were very angry, very confused about why Iran would cease Operation True Promise 3 just when it looked like Israeli air defenses were about to run out. Israel was on the ropes militarily in the sense that these missile strikes were becoming more and more effective the more that Iran launched them. And of course, the United States had just struck Iran in defense of Israel and, of course, for its own aims to build up toward a war with it. So there was a lot of confusion and anger amongst those who, one, want to see the genocide in Gaza, and they want to see the Israeli regime be put in its place. And, of course, they want to see a full throttle defense against U.S. interests and U.S. interference in the region. And I understand all of that. But I think we also have to understand, too, that Iran was not looking for war in the first place. Iran did not want to fight a prolonged and protracted war, which inevitably would create and wreak havoc all over the region, even more than exists now. So it's a difficult position to be in for Iran because on the one hand, it likely has the capabilities to continue to fight Israel and continue to stand up to the United States. On the other, Iran understands, and I think anyone who's watching this, those who are very astute when it comes to geopolitics and global developments should also understand that the United States and Israel will not let up their destructive capacity toward the region. I think the Gaza genocide shows this. What happened in Lebanon and continues to happen in Lebanon shows this. What's happening in Syria shows this. And of course, Iran has lost nearly 1,000 people to this war of aggression against it. So with that said, I think we have to understand this ceasefire is really not a ceasefire at all. Iran was very clear that it was stopping hostilities only on the condition that Israel stops its hostilities, and the U.S., of course, stops, supporting those hostilities. And that, in effect, is not really a ceasefire that has any kind of terms, any kind of conditions. It's not like what was brokered around the Gaza genocide when the Trump administration first came in. It's not what was brokered in Lebanon by the U.S. and a few European countries, Qatar, etc. Around Hezbollah. Those terms don't exist. Really, all this is a pause that is completely conditional on Israel stopping its aggressive maneuvers against Iran. And for the first time, I think, in perhaps Israel's entire history, there was a brief period where Israel had to fight back against Arab nationalism, for example, but those states were nowhere near the strength of what Iran is. For the first time in Israel's history, they have to take into consideration the fact that at any moment Iran could continue, and that's highly likely. So all that is to say is that's how I view this. It's a temporary pause. The United States could not afford the costs that a full-scale war with Iran would bring, whether it's the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, whether it was just a military campaign that would completely destroy Donald Trump's reputation as what I think is a fake agent of peace, the so-called peace president. Just after the ceasefire, he posted that horrific, rendition of the Beach Boys song to the tune of "Bomb, Bomb, Iran," in ode to his dear friend John McCain, who did that on the campaign trail in 2007, horribly and laughably, if anyone catches that video. But all of this, for me, is to say that there's a lot of elements here going on, a lot of factors to consider when it comes to why the hostilities have, for now, been scaled back, and there's been a cessation of hostilities. But at the same time, this war is far from over. This is, and Iran knows this is a protracted war. Iranians are celebrating because they see this as a victory in this protracted war, but certainly not the end of it. So that's how I see this ceasefire at this time.
How do you view the current position that we're in right now, and kind of how Iran is treading carefully? On one hand, they're sitting there saying, hey, we want to follow international law, right? We want for there to be some sort of a deal, or at least that's what they've said previously. But then on the other hand, they can't trust anyone around them. And we all know, just as we saw from Trump, that he wants regime change. We know that Israel wants regime change. That's been put out very loudly in front of Iran. So where does that leave them?
Well, if Iranian officials in leadership were watching the video that Donald Trump posted, the rendition of the Beach Boys song to the tune of Bomb Bomb Iran, one of the lyrics of that is putting the Ayatollah in a box. So there is a very clear expression that the U.S.'s overall goal is to overthrow, not only assassinate the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but everything that the Iranian government truly represents, in the sense of its steadfast sovereignty, its support for regional resistance, and of course, its key role in the development of a multipolar world alongside Russia and China. So that it should be communicated very clearly. I'm not an expert on Iranian internal politics, and it's quite clear that it's complex and that there are divisions and disagreements, just like in any other society. But there is also, as you said, a tightrope that needs to be walked here for Iran and really any country that's trying to both survive and operate in a world where U.S. hegemony is dying, but it's dangerously dying. It is incredibly aggressive, and it's one that is not afraid to exhaust itself in order to maintain whatever it has left in full spectrum dominance. So Iran has been for many years now, even into and only up to this, escalation of warfare against it that happened earlier in June. It has been attempting to both, one, use negotiations as a platform to show the world that it is interested in following the nuclear proliferation treaty, that it's interested in using dialogue to ensure that it meets the national interests of Iran. People tend to forget that it's not just about negotiating or trusting the United States. It's about the fact that Iran is under heavy sanctions from the US. And if it can get any leverage at all to end those sanctions, regardless of the trust, it sets a political precedent that is useful to Iran, even if temporarily, gives Iran time, as we have seen in Operation True Promise 3, to develop the capabilities to defend itself should things go awry. So a lot of what Iran attempts to do is to buy time for itself to not only survive, but to develop forward so that when acts of aggression like we saw in the so-called 12-day war happen, it is capable of weathering the storm. People also tend to forget that this is kind of an unprecedented conflict in recent history, really since the advent of the multipolar world, in the sense that Iran, as being seen as maybe the weakest link of the three main powers in this new emerging world order led by China and Russia, while the West sees Iran as the weakest link, Iran just showed that it is actually quite strong and that it is able to weather what was an unprecedented act of aggression that started inside of Iran. It started with, it wasn't the Israeli warplanes did not fly over Iran and start dropping bombs. That wasn't what happened. There were literal operations from the Mossad, the U.S., that have been built up for many years to sabotage Iran's, defensive capabilities. And that's how they struck. They struck with drones inside of its territory. And while that shows a major problem Iran has to solve, the fact that it was able to weather it has sent a strong message that those tactics aren't necessarily going to lead to regime change. So Iran is seeing this, of course, as a victory, but likely a temporary one, one that will require, of course, and Pezeshkian said this for all the criticism against him in his speech to the Iranian people. He said, we need to review what went well and what went badly. So here, the lessons of this conflict must be borne out. On the one hand, it's obvious that Iran has built up a very impressive capacity, especially around ballistic missiles, to be able to fight back and to basically hit Israel wherever it wants. I don't even believe it scratched its total capacity, despite all of the bluster that pro-Israeli, pro-American types have been spreading all across the social media sphere. Iran has said that it hadn't even dipped into really what is its war-ready arsenal. So we haven't seen its full capacity. But at the same time, I think there are many lessons. For example, the fact that Iran's air defenses, for a country of its stature, of its development, of what it has had gone through, it's impressive. Yes, 900 plus people died, but that is nothing compared to what Israel has done in Lebanon, and of course to what it's done against Palestine, which of course has no state. So Iran has to, of course, be considering how do they improve that situation? How do they ensure that, yes, 900 people do not die in a matter of less than 2 weeks because of U.S. and Israeli aggression? It's a difficult question. It's a difficult thing to pursue, though, because now it's about, okay, who do you go to? Do you get into a deeper alliance with Russia? The defense minister of Iran is in China right now. Is that what they're discussing? It's unclear, but this is really, given the nature of war, what the U.S. and Israel can do to Iran. This is the biggest, I think, glaring lesson, is that the skies of Iran are not going to be safe because they're unfortunately surrounded by states that can't be trusted. For example, Azerbaijan was allowing Israel to use its airspace. Iraq, of course, despite the resistance there, that's heavily aligned with Iran. Their political system is not strong enough and capable enough to assert sovereignty over Israel. So they were using Iraqi airspace to hit Western Iran. That has to, I'm sure that's part of the calculations on how now to regroup, knowing that, of course, the United States and Israel are going to be regrouping. And at some point in the future, when it is politically expedient, this will reemerge. And how it reemerges could be even more dangerous, could be even more violent and brutal than what we even saw here.
When it comes to the position that Israel's in right now, as you were noting earlier, they're still continuing on this genocide against the Palestinians. They're killing dozens of Palestinians on a near daily basis. They're also continuing to bomb Lebanon. I mean, they've violated that quote unquote ceasefire almost every day there. And I know that there has been some frustration from people online, right? They thought that Iran should have said, okay, we'll have a ceasefire, but you have to stop bombing Gaza first. And because that didn't happen, because Iran was more, focused on their direct conflict with Israel, there is kind of some frustration there. But how do you view the position that Israel and the US are in? Obviously, the Iranian government did not magically crumble, but now Israel's having to contend with all of this destruction and the fact that it has waged this regional war and continued to escalate. And it's not able to handle the response and the retaliation that it's getting in return.
Well, it's a very good question. And I truly do believe that this so-called 12-day war led by the United States and Israel has really been incredibly detrimental to the future of the Israeli colony, the Zionist colony. And a big reason for this, of course, is that Israel has learned that it does not have the capabilities to ensure that the colony is safe from Iranian retaliation against its aggressive maneuvers on the Islamic Republic of Iran, that it is not invincible. And now, unlike, for example, what happened on October 7th, unlike even the Yemeni attacks, retaliations in solidarity with Palestine, even Hezbollah, when it was fighting directly with Israel, now you have a state that has the capacity to cause immense destruction to the cities of the Israeli colony. And so that has sent direct, it's far beyond psychological now. It is a material reality for the Zionists, for the settlers, that they are actually not safe. It is not simply a Yemeni hypersonic missile landing outside of Ben Gurion Airport and causing all the pandemonium and the sirens. Now these sirens have been backed up with literal destruction, people losing their homes, their businesses, their lives, military headquarters, facilities, the Mossad, the Weizmann Institute, on and on and on, all of these, the Haifa port, all of these places that were hit directly by Iranian missiles have demonstrated to Israelis themselves that they have bit off more than they can chew. And so we heard Benjamin Netanyahu right after the ceasefire, oh, time to go back to Gaza, because that's where right now Netanyahu and Israel's leadership see the possibilities of continuing on the fight, because at this time Israel is in this mode of desperate expansion. It sees its time is really running out. The world views Israel as a pariah. The world has seen what it's done in Gaza and Lebanon, and now Syria, and now Iran, and the world is very much against the Israeli regime. It's maybe the most unpopular regime in the world at the moment, which is unprecedented given that the United States and the Western mainstream media do their best to give them full cover for their crimes. So this is a very bad position for Israel to be in. But that does mean the more desperate Israel becomes, the more it's going to continue to demand the United States come to its aid, like it did with the so-called Israel-Iran war. The more it's going to try to escalate its aggression regionally so that it can find itself in a more immediately favorable position. And of course, Netanyahu himself and the current Israeli government, its leadership, they really do need these endless wars of expansion, because they themselves have really cornered the future of their own leadership. Either they continue onward in this way, or they have to face the consequences, which are humiliating for a leadership of a colony that views itself as all invincible, the apex of civilization, the only democracy in the Middle East, the strongest military in the Middle East. All of this is crumbling the more and more it goes on with its expansionism. And that's why Netanyahu, forget the crimes. Everyone focus on the legal stuff, all of this. Forget that. The Israeli regime is a completely and utterly disastrous, a regime that is committed to genocide and colonial expansion, does not care about corruption. That's a ridiculous thing to think that they care about that. What matters is how much does Netanyahu at this moment serve the aims of Israel, greater Israel, its expansionism, versus how much does he embarrass it? How much does he hold it back? How much does he make decisions in his, current coalition, make decisions that are to the detriment in the medium term or long term to this project? That's what's going to decide his fate. That's why he continues and his leadership continues onward in this way. But as we saw with Iran, you play with fire, you might very well get burned. And Israel got burned very hard here in the short term. The risk, though, and this is why Iran and, of course, the rest of the multipolar world is always watching how the imperial powers, the U.S., and now, as our friend Loki would say, imperial Israel, how they behave, how they think about things, is not so much about their own stability, but how quickly they can, how long they can enact the maximum amount of suffering and pain upon their adversaries and targets so that they eventually collapse. They had lost in Syria, but after a decade plus of sanctions, the inability to rebuild, and all that happened to Syria in that U.S.-led dirty war, eventually the Syrian government collapsed. So Iran is watching. Iran is not going to fall into that trap. Of course, the rest of the multipolar world, led by Russia and China, also has to be watching this too. But that's where the risk is the U.S. and Israel, for all of their limitations, they are committed to, if it destroys themselves, they'll do it anyway, in the hopes that they will be allowed to. And I think this is where the message to ordinary Americans, to people in the United States, to people in the West, has to be very clear that this isn't going to end on its own. You shouldn't be relying on Iran to end aggression that is being done by your own government. If you want to see an end to a genocide, then you need to stop your government from doing that. That is, I think, where some of the frustration comes from. Americans and Westerners have a hard time dealing with the powerlessness that they have in stopping their own regimes, which are really dictated by militarists and corporations and monopolies and banks that already cause them suffering in their own way. But to stop and to demand an end and to actually enforce that end from your own government is a really difficult question. So that also has to be put here. That has to be put into the equation as, ordinary people in the United States, in the collective West, Israel. I mean, we already know Israel as the colony doesn't have the diversity necessary in its worldview to really make that happen amongst those settlers. But really, it's the U.S. here that is the big problem, and it's people in the United States that are going to have to intervene to stop this. And we that's where we can play our role and truly be in solidarity with those who stand with Palestine, and of course the rest of the region, that is facing this violent expansionist regime.
Mr. Trump, he's over in The Hague today, although not exactly there to talk about his support for genocide, although I wish that he were. But instead, he's there to rally the troops as NATO leaders commit to an overall defense spending goal of 5% of their GDP. Now, it seemed like it was hard enough to get NATO members to spend 2% on defense, so I don't know how they're going to get to this brand new goal. But how do you view this position NATO is in as a reflection of US hegemony and kind of the overall Western world, especially when I thought it was notable that in their joint statement from today, the focus seemed to be more on warning about Russia than even support for Ukraine. Ukraine was only mentioned a couple of times.
Well, Ukraine is lost. I think that is the cold, hard reality that the United States and its NATO vassals are having a difficult time acknowledging, but that is the truth. That's why there's a lot of avoidance around it. And honestly, the U.S. foreign policy establishment was I think, very, very, very pleased that they could focus on another theater of war and get people's attention off of Ukraine for at least a little while. I don't know if you saw, Rachel, but Mark Rutte, that the NATO General Secretary, known as really Trump's second-hand man in NATO, he when Donald Trump was asked about Mark Rutte calling him daddy, he said, "Oh well," he said it very kindly and lovely. This is how this is the true character of NATO. NATO is actually the a servile child. It really is just an entity that is doing the bidding of U.S. interests. And it is so clear now that NATO, of course, has the countries within it. It's just a U.S. operation, and the countries within it are just there to serve U.S. interests, which in the case of Ukraine, of course, is the weakening of Russia. That's failed. Where people get more confused is about Israel. Of course, there's a lot of people who believe Israel controls the U.S. versus the U.S. controlling Israel. Well, in the recent reports, we've seen that there's always these talks of Donald Trump giving a stern talking to. He recently yelled at Netanyahu more than a few times in the last 12 days, but recently around, you better stop this, you better not break the ceasefire. And of course, we know that before he came into office, he sent Steve Witkoff, and Witkoff brokered that ceasefire very quickly, and Israel obliged. I think it's important to understand that the U.S. and Israel are different than, let's say, NATO. NATO is simply an appendage of the United States. The U.S. and Israel, they operate together. And what the U.S. has done with Israel is they've created such a monster of a vassal that it has a very difficult time maintaining leverage over, because the U.S. is actually losing influence in the region. And Israel is always going to be a centerpiece of the region, a military outpost for the United States. Then now Israel actually has a lot of leverage over the United States. So when Israel says we want to do something, the U.S. politicians have to listen. It's not just about the money. It's about how the U.S. is able to assert its own influence over the region. But we have to understand that if Donald Trump truly wanted to, if any U.S. administration truly wanted to rein in Israel, call this theoretical, other side, but it could easily do this. That is what the so-called Gaza ceasefire that never really was demonstrated, despite the fact that, of course, we know that Trump just gave Israel, it was just a piece of paper. Hey, you sign this, do whatever you want. We're really not going to enforce it. Go ahead, continue on the genocide. However, if Donald Trump we heard the reports. Jerusalem Post said that the Israeli officials were shocked and stunned. Netanyahu was, shell-shocked by the berating that he got. If Donald Trump and the U.S. administration wanted to put real pressure behind that, it could lead to change. So all this is to say is that the U.S. holds the cards on Israel. If the United States wanted to stop its military aid to Israel, if it wanted to stop its cover for Israel's crimes, it could, but it won't, because those crimes serve U.S. interests, not our interests, not those of ordinary Americans, and maybe not really total for the U.S. system as a whole. Israel could very well be that cog in, or that thread in the aging clothing that the U.S. empire is wearing right now, that eventually will just completely fall off and diminish the empire as a whole. But that's not how U.S. foreign policymakers and elites see Israel. They see Israel as key to their foreign policy interests. And that's why the strategic plans of Israel, Oded Yanan plan, clean break, they always align with the U.S.'s foreign policy and its so-called strategic planning, and how it looks at where it is going to go, what it is going to do, what countries it wants to conduct regime change around, how it wants to destabilize a particular region, how it wants to assert its dominance. There's a reason why those two things really run in parallel, and it's because Israel serves a very key role for the United States, one that NATO, in theory, also serves. But the truth is that European countries, they do not serve the same kind of special role that Israel does. They are simply along for the ride. They are there to give the U.S. whatever it wants, and they have no real choice in the matter. They don't have the leverage that Israel has, and this is why we see a kind of different dynamic here. We see this kind of bowing down to the U.S. whenever it's necessary by NATO, while you see much more of a struggle when it comes to the U.S. and Israel. You see Israel sometimes being able to say, hey, we know who we are to you, so you need to ensure that we are given what we need to do what we can do for you. That's the kind of relationship I believe we're looking at here.